Alright, so moving on to Judas Iscariot. Um, Ehrman makes the claim that Matthew and Luke, there's a discrepancy in Matthew and Luke on why Judas betrayed Jesus. Well, looking through the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, right up, prior to the arrest of Jesus during the Last Supper and so on, and then up through the crucifixion and the suicide of Judas, I couldn't really find anything in Matthew that gave a reason why Judas was doing the betrayal. It does say that he got money for the betrayal, for betraying Jesus, 30 pieces of silver, but it also says that in Luke. So if Matthew and Luke agree, if his reason was to get 30 pieces of silver, then there's no discrepancy there. Now in Luke, we have the added detail that's not in Matthew, that Satan enters into Judas. So we could say that in Luke, the reason for the betrayal is because of Satan entering into him, but there is nothing in Matthew, one way or the other, about the reason behind the betrayal. So uh, there is no discrepancy, contrary to what Ehrman says, between Matthew and Luke on why Judas was betrayed. Luke says it was because of Satan entering into him, entering into Judas. Matthew doesn't give a reason, so there's no discrepancy there. Then Ehrman goes on and says that when we look at Matthew and compare that to the book of Acts, there's a discrepancy over who bought the field, whether it was Judas or the Jewish authorities that paid Jesus, and how the field got its name, the field of blood, uh, and how Judas died. Well, the first thing to note that in the book of Acts, which was written by Luke, or whomever wrote the book of Luke, the Gospel according to Luke, and uh, it is not Luke himself who is explaining these things in the book of Acts, rather it is Peter. So when Peter says that Judas bought this field and he fell headlong and his innards gushed out, and that's why it's called the field of blood. Uh, if Peter was mistaken about that, and if Luke uh, recorded not what Peter said, but if Luke himself had said that that is why the field is called the field of blood, and Judas himself was the one who bought it, then that would be historically inaccurate. But if Peter was mistaken and Luke was merely saying, Peter says this is what happened, then there wouldn't be an error. There'd be an error on the part of Peter, but not on the part of Luke, the author of the book of Acts. So uh, perhaps that is what Peter thought, but he was mistaken. Now, when we see, so it's not the Bible that's in error, it's something that somebody said that's recorded in the Bible that's in error. So it's what Luke is saying that Peter said what Peter said was in error, but Luke is accurately reporting what Peter did in fact say. So that may be one way to handle that. Um, but I think that when something happens, a major event, and it's kind of traumatic, and there's a lot of different perspectives on it. In this case, I'm speaking of the crucifixion of Jesus, or things surrounding the crucifixion of Jesus. Um, it's not surprising that uh, there may be might not be totally clear. Think in our own day, uh, when the planes were flown into the Twin Towers, um, it was not immediately clear what was going on. It was clear that planes had flown into the towers, but people were saying, well, we think this is an act of terrorism, but we really don't know for sure. It's hard to imagine it being something else, but we don't have all the facts. And then as more facts came in, they said, okay, yes, it's Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden and so on and so forth. Um, so when an event first happens, it's not entirely clear all the details. So there's perhaps conflicting reports. Everything is not ironed out in great detail exactly what happened in secondary details. So I would suggest that if we suppose that may have been what happened, that excuse me, Luke writing whenever he wrote, uh, it was some number of decades after the event, so he had time to process all the information and investigate it carefully. But Peter uh, may have just been speaking kind of off the cuff, uh, closer in time to the events before all the facts had come in, and it was pretty chaotic at that time, perhaps. So uh, these are some ways that we could deal with that discrepancy. But I want to suggest another thing, and that is that in the first century, the idea of crucifixion uh, was a lot broader uh, than merely death by being nailed to a cross. If a person was tied a rope around their neck and hung themselves to commit suicide, that would be considered crucifixion as well. The Jehovah's Witnesses are can the, and this broader understanding of crucifixion, it's any kind of death by suspension, by being suspended in air, by being hung, if you will, hung in the air. Uh, it is why Jehovah's Witnesses can almost get away with the claim that Jesus wasn't nailed to a cross. He was impaled on a stake. He was killed on a torture stake. They can almost get away with that because that would be considered crucifixion. Um, so when it says that Judas hanged himself, it could, if hanging oneself is similar to crucifixion in that it doesn't mean just the limited uh, kind of crucifixion that we think of, being nailed to a cross. Perhaps he impaled himself. He may have jumped on a stake. He may have jumped onto to sharpen the end of a tree and jumped onto that. Well, if that's what happened, uh, that would not explain uh, thinking that he himself had bought the field directly, um, but it would explain the idea of him. In Matthew it says he hanged himself, and in Acts Peter says that his innards fell onto the floor, onto the ground. Um, so that would explain that aspect of it. Um, so we have to be careful not to restrict the language too narrowly. The Gospels and the Book of Acts and the whole Bible were written, as I've said before, in a specific time, in a specific culture, in a specific context. So we cannot take the Greek language of the first century and read into it customs and linguistic conventions and so on that we have in contemporary English. So yeah, so I think that these examples of Jesus and now Judas, and next we'll deal with Paul, uh, these discrepancies are not something. Ehrman admits that some of them may not be uh, contradictions per se, but he does say that these are the most important and interesting of the discrepancies in his opinion, and that they can't all be reconciled. But I think really the only true problems at best out of all the ones that we've looked at so far was with the um, oh, I'm looking at the list here. The when Jesus and his family had left Bethlehem, if they went to Egypt first or not, and then exactly how Judas died and who paid for the field. Those would be the best candidates for an actual contradiction or even an actual discrepancy. Really, there hasn't been a very strong case made for outright contradiction. And again, Ehrman wasn't saying that these are all outright contradictions, and Jesus interrupted. But the implication seems to be that within this list, there is enough to show beyond a reasonable doubt that the Bible cannot be trusted. He seems to think in other places outside of the book even that to give the impression that the Bible is hopelessly contradictory, and that's even part of the subtitle of Jesus Interrupted about the contradictions in the Bible. Uh, I forget exactly how it's worded. I don't have the book with me anymore. I got it at the library, but it was examining the hidden contradictions and inconsistencies of the New Testament or something like that. So I think that this impression that he wants to leave his audience with, that it's hopelessly self-contradictory, we can't trust it at all, it gives us little to no historical insights of the real Jesus, uh, it it doesn't hold up to scrutiny. So, um, but maybe I'll get into that a little bit more after we look at Paul and give kind of a some general concluding remarks. Now, there's five different things about Paul, comparing Acts, what it says in Acts, to what it says in the Pauline epistles. Um, and of course, the Pauline epistles would have been written by Paul, the book of Acts written by Luke. So the uh, allegation is that we should trust what Paul says about himself over what Luke says, which I suppose is a good rule of thumb to follow. But the problem here, I think, is not as bad as Ehrman would like to make it, where everything Luke says is completely contradicted by the various things that Paul says. So we will look at that in subsequent videos. Thank you for watching, and Shalom out.